right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political, sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm here today with Dan Stevens, who is an athlete and who has testified for Parliament. He has also done quite extensive research on some, historical, archaeological facts, and we're going to dive in today on how some of this stuff might be interrelated, although you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. How are you doing today, Dan?
Hi, yeah, thanks for inviting me to come and have a chat with you as well. So, I've seen your podcasts and your YouTube. So, I thought I'd reach out and have a chat because we seem to be on the same page.
I'm sorry?
We seem to be on the same page on some stuff, and I think there's some dots that I can help join and some new dots that I can bring in as well. So, thanks.
I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, very much. I'm so glad you did reach out. So for those of us who may not be as familiar with who you are, what your backstory is, tell us a little bit about your history and how you came to, where you are today with some of these discoveries and why you got into this research.
Yeah, well, it's a strange story. I just grew up wanting to be a graphic designer or an architect, something like that. So I always had a kind of an idea of design and architectural kind of buildings and sort of modern art and typography and graphic design. But I was also quite a good athlete as well. So at the age of 13, I started track and field, was running 100 meters and 200 meters, and was always top 10 in the UK. Wow. And then progressed into 400 meters and was running 400 meter track and then 400 meter hurdles as well. And then around the age of 16, I progressed into mountain biking and road cycling. That's really kind of what I enjoyed more. And I started doing a lot of training and that became my main focus until I got ME. I had glandular fever that wasn't really diagnosed properly, and then I later discovered I had Epstein-Barr virus, and it really kind of knocked the stuffing out of me, and ultimately I stopped all sport for probably about 10 years and got a job, set up my own business, and didn't really pay much attention to anything that was going on in the world. So I was kind of asleep. Yeah.
Days, right?
But I remember at the age of 14 or 15, I think, a relative gave me Erich von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods.
What? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Erich von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, which is what the kind of whole Ancient Aliens TV series is based on, and I'd always had an interest in the design stuff and the architectural stuff, and also the archaeological things that you see. Because if you know how to design stuff and you're interested in designing things, then you kind of question what you see in history, because you've got an idea of what it takes to make this stuff. And I'd always done a little bit of kind of part-time work to pocket money kind of work with builders and decorators. So I had an idea of what it took to move bricks up ladders and dig holes. And, when you've done that work, it really kind of puts it in context in terms of like looking at places like Stonehenge and dragging huge megalithic blocks. So I suppose that background set me up to look at sport, the business stuff set me up to deal with kind of the business world and what it takes to put projects together and manage people and manage sites. I had about 35 people working for me at one time. So I've got a good idea of what it takes to kind of order component parts, organize people, find trained people, put them on sites, design these things. And obviously the sporting background sees you in the gym quite a lot as well. So you know how heavy things are. So yeah, kind of that yeah, I've got a mixed background really, but probably no different to most people that might be listening to us now.
Great. I'll tell you a really funny side note, but when I was like thinking of starting this podcast, somebody asked me about like, well, who's your target audience? And, you know, because I've discussed a wide range of things, you know, and it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, we're going to discuss like health and fitness and politics and philosophy and psychology. And he was like, so like the politically minded fit person, that sounds like a weird audience. I'm like, I don't know. I think it works.
That's like a normal audience, isn't it? As opposed to like a far, you know, some kind of woke left. You know, and I think people are generally interested in health, interested in fitness. I think people are also interested in kind of medication, pharmaceuticals. I think there are things going on within the pharmaceutical industry that are hypocritical. From a sports background, I kind of progressed into some stuff around doping, and that's why I spoke to Parliament. So it's a funny background for me because I was I had ME and Epstein-Barr virus, and that was undiagnosed. So I kind of felt let down by the medical industry as an athlete. And to fight, it was later in life that I found out that I'd had Epstein-Barr virus, which really knocks the stuffing out of you. And that kind of led me to look at other tests as well. And so I started looking at my testosterone levels and whether that had caused issues. I become, because of the ME thing and the level I was competing at sport, I knew some like high level coaches and medical staff, medical support staff that had done work for like UK Athletics or British Cycling. And I became involved in a research project at Birmingham University, and they were looking at ME in general, and they were looking at overtrained athletes and blood markers that they could detect and create a blood test for ME. So yeah, from there, I kind of started looking at what my natural hormonal levels.
I'm sorry, you said for ME?
ME. So post-viral fatigue syndrome. And that kind of is just chronic fatigue. And I remember I was racing and going well, and then I was getting sick, like with flu-like symptoms. So this is probably like year 2000. And then I'd get better, and then build up my training. I'd start going well, and I'd get sick. And this is kind of like what Epstein-Barr virus does, generates post-viral fatigue, and you can sort of shake it off short term and not long term. But what I discovered is I actually had a naturally low testosterone level as well. So the recovery was probably, it's a chicken or egg scenario. Have you got a hormone deficiency, which is stopping you, which is delaying your recovery? Or is a viral infection like ME giving you a low testosterone because you're effectively overtrained, although you're not doing a lot of training, you're under recovering.
Right.
And this is always the critical question with sport.
Creating a continuous stress.
Yeah. Are you overtraining, i.e. that you're doing too much training, or are you doing too much training before you've recovered? Or are you just not recovering properly?
But there's also, if you're under chronic stress, that's going to make you, that's going to have the symptom of overtraining. Whereas if you weren't under the same stress load, you might be able to recover from, you know? Yeah.
And the two go hand in hand, because you can be chronically fatigued,
right,
naturally, and then stressed that you're not recovering, which then becomes depressing. And it becomes a bit of a spiral. And I think because of that, I'd always been interested in like eating healthy, eating clean, and more recently, like kind of looking at what's in the water in Britain. The water is really bad. So I distill my water now and, drink pure water.
Yeah.
And if you look at the contents of a water distiller, it will give you an idea of what's just come out of your water. So I think like when you're talking about this stuff, you can see cycles and patterns with kind of inefficient medical doctors, diagnosis. I think in America it's different, everything's private. In Britain, you've got a national health service, they'll cut corners. And then you look at what's in the water and what's in the food, and you start asking questions about, kind of, is that causing hormone deficiencies? Are we being poisoned with the food we eat? And then you start.
A lot of evidence to indicate we are. Yeah.
Yeah, it would seem that way. It would absolutely seem that way. So yeah, that's roughly kind of, a broad brush kind of overview of what my background is anyway.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you discovered with the doping in sports, your personal experience and the conclusions.
Yeah, so I got ill around about 2003 and was yo-yoing between kind of getting sick and recovering, and then I decided just to not do it, like just basically pack sport in. And then I returned to cycling probably around about 2007, 2008. And by then the post-viral fatigue syndrome had gone. I was running my own business. I was eating very well, probably ate a bit too much, which is one of the reasons I needed to start cycling or doing some sport again. I'd also been in the gym and kind of just rebuilt some muscle and, just got generally stronger. So initially it started going quite well. I was getting fit, recovering quite quickly. And then I found I still wasn't recovering as quickly as I thought I should. And it was around about that time that I started looking at kind of hormones and testosterone and things like that. And also the internet was obviously a lot bigger then compared to previously in 2000. We had to go and see doctors. Now you can kind of read a lot and do a lot of research. And I think that growth of the internet has opened a lot of people's eyes on a lot of subjects, and that's really what we're seeing now is kind of the genie's out the bottle on so many different things, because you can Google it and look it up, which are now trying to rein back in. So I kind of realized that I needed to get my testosterone tested, and that's when I found out I had a low testosterone level. Now I made contact with a British cycling doctor who diagnosed that and said, you can apply for a therapeutic use exemption for testosterone because it's so low. But at the time I was kind of really unaware of the anti-doping rules. If you go to a doctor and he says you're ill, you're aware that some people are allowed, if you're generally sick, then you shouldn't be stopped from using that medication, then it's you just assume it's okay. So he diagnosed that, and I started using testosterone, and I went, the doctor I saw originally was in Manchester. I live near London, so I moved, saw another doctor. Once this guy was a sports doctor diagnosed it, I then went to Harley Street because it was more local to me. And this doctor just gave me a prescription for testosterone gel. I could have applied for a therapeutic use exemption, but didn't, because I just wasn't aware that I would need to. And then I basically started building up a relationship with this doctor. And it kind of got interesting from there, because it turned out that the doctor actually wanted clients to dope as well. And as the relationship kind of built up with this doctor, he started telling me that he worked with a lot of athletes, and a lot of athletes were doping. And he mentioned a lot of Premiership football clubs. At the time, there were 3 or 4 that were using his services. And it was like, okay, so I'm not really racing professionally. I'm doing it for hobby. I'm just getting fit, really, and I'm competing for fun. although it was going quite well. And he started talking about growth hormone and EPO. And at the time, there was lots of stories about celebrities using growth hormone for anti-aging purposes.
Sure.
And he was an anti-aging doctor as well.
Of course.
And then he started talking about blood doping and EPO. And I'd heard a lot of...
For what? What is EPO?
Pardon?
What does EPO stand for?
So EPO is erythropoietin. What your kidneys do is produce red blood cells, and your red blood cells carry oxygen. So the more oxygen you're carrying, the faster you're going to go on a bike. So EPO is basically
threshold.
Yeah. So that is exactly what Lance Armstrong was doing. So it's the same process and the same drugs. So this guy was saying, look, I work with British athletes who are based in Britain, who are riding for British cycling and are competing in the Tour de France, that are using this stuff that you all know. And, you know, I think at the time it's kind of like, well, is he really working with these people? Is he not? But, you know, this guy is giving me the opportunity to try this stuff. I'd been a quick athlete, and I'd seen not very talented athletes make huge gains. So this was now probably around about the 2008, 2009 period, where the Lance Armstrong story was unraveling. I was, like I say, competing, and doping was becoming an open secret. And a lot of the athletes I'd competed with, when I discussed kind of like ME, Epstein-Barr virus, chronic fatigue, was sort of literally just said, well, we've been doing this anyway, so you know, you should have done that. And these guys have made careers as professional athletes. So I kind of got sucked into this doctrine. It's like, well, it's there, I might as well do it to see what it's like.
Sure.
So I took EPO, really from an experimental basis, and I was training with power. So I was cycling a lot, measuring my power output in watts. And at the time, I'd probably weigh about 76, 77 kilograms. And I was riding for about 35, 40 minutes at 300 watts. And so that was the pre-EPO, pre-blood doping kind of set. So 76, 77 kilograms, 300 watts for 30 odd minutes. So then within a few months of taking EPO, I was 71 kilograms and doing 380 watts for an hour and a half.
Wow.
So yeah, I'm just going to switch off this email as it keeps beeping. Yeah, so that was really the eye opener, because
that's a jump.
yeah, and it explained a lot for me. So I raced on it, and it wasn't really a great it was a funny experience, because you could ride from the back of the pack to the front of the pack, and you wasn't even sweating, or you wasn't out of breath. And then you could do it again. So when I say I was doing that kind of power increase, the other gain was that I could do the same thing the next day, because I wasn't tired from the day before.
Wow.
And it was because you got more oxygen as well in your body, in your blood. Oxygen burns fat. Fat needs oxygen to burn. So the more oxygen you've got in your blood, the more you're burning fat, the leaner you get. And there's kind of recovery type properties to EPO as well. And it's been used with spinal cord injury patients to rebuild the spinal cord with success.
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
Nerve generation too.
Yeah. And it's also that, so you see that in your skin, you start feeling like you're a 14-year-old again. Your skin is completely clear. So it is being used in Hollywood for anti-aging purposes, because you look at pictures of like Lance is a good example. You look at his skin, and it's kind of like slightly yellowy, almost like you've been shrink wrapped, like you've got polythene or on your, you can, like, it's like plasticky. You've got very little body fat, very clear eyes, and a very healthy glow about you.
Yeah.
Simply because you've got more red blood cells, you've got your skin will go a different color because you can see your blood change color. From a kind of a red to a dark crimson, and that's because there's more iron and red blood cells in your blood. That simple. So it was quite an interesting experience, because what I then found was that I would compete in races where there would be a breakaway group of maybe 3 riders that would just ride off the front of the pack and put some time. So the races I was doing on the road were probably 3 to 4 hour long races, and you'd see a break go, and it would be like 3 or 4 really strong riders would ride off of the front of a pack of 60 riders, and those 60 riders still couldn't catch these other guys. So it's like, God, what are they doing? What are they eating? And that's like, who's coaching them? What can we do? So
tricks.
Yeah, and here I was then with this extra power, and I was able just to go with those guys. And to my surprise, that I would be riding in the pack with a group of riders trying to chase these lads down, and everyone was breathing really hard, everyone was sweating really hard, their eyes were red, their face was red, and they were taking it in turns and working really, really hard. What I found is I could kind of ride off the front of the pack with these guys, and what I found is when I was with those guys, none of them were breathing hard, none of them were sweating, and all of them looked like I did. And then that's when when they started saying, well, what are you doing? Because this is what we're doing. And it was a bit of a shock, really, because it was clear that doping in sport is an open secret.
Right.
But it's like Formula One, if you develop that new suspension package or that new engine package or that new aerodynamic package, you don't tell your competitors about that. But then if they then start beating you, you might swap a few tips. This is what we've been doing with our suspension setup and our wing setup. What have you been doing? And you kind of like that's how things progress in life in general. It's kind of like evolutionary. Right. And the issue with like that level of doping is that it's very obvious what you're doing to the other people that are doing it. And if you are doing it, you it's a bit like going into the gym and you see really, really stacked, big athletes with big bulgy muscles and veins everywhere. Now you're aware that they're doing testosterone or steroids or whatever. Is that obvious? In an aerobic format, it's the opposite. People are really, really skinny, but really muscular, and look very gaunt, but healthy. But it's in the race that you see the difference. Right. And it's in the race when you're doing it and you're with those people and you're not breathing at all and you're attacking really hard and literally sitting up to recover for maybe 20 or 30 seconds and then just going again. So that was what happened. Yeah.
So you started taking these different therapies, and what were some of the, I read your case, so I knew, but for, the audience, can you talk a little bit about, the experience? Were there any effects that you had, any negative effects, any negative impacts?
No, none. And there were a lot of, like, I was more coherent. I could think clearer. I was dreaming kind of all the time. And the main issue is the skin, like everyone wants kind of like, young skin, sure, like kind of baby faced, fresh skin. And that was what I noticed. My eyes were never bloodshot. I'd recover really quickly, and my skin was really, really clear, and the body fat just fell off of me. And I wasn't particularly eating really healthy. I just found that I could eat moderately healthy. Like previously, I was obsessed with clean food, almost like bordering on having an eating disorder. That kind of level of obsession, weighing food, making sure I wasn't eating too much, but getting just enough. I'd read hundreds of like books on nutrition and followed, nutritional doctors that were working with athletes. And that's where it really, the level of sporting fraud become evident, because you realize that these diets are a cover story for doping.
Wow, that's really interesting.
And
Yeah.
you realize that the same thing applies in Hollywood as well.
Right.
Yeah. And in the difference is in Hollywood, some actors will say, well, look, I am just on growth hormone repair, therapy. Because there'll be doctors that would be selling, especially in the US, they were selling growth hormone off label for anti-aging purposes.
Sure.
Some athletes and some celebrities would say that it was the new seaweed soup diet that was doing it. But of course, you see 16-year-old girls that want to look like their female hero, or you see, guys that want to look like their male hero, that buy the books and follow the diets and don't have the same results, and then become anorexic or bulimic. And that's where you see real fraud. That is proper fraud. And that's really concerning. And so I think there's an issue with what you would define as doping being a sporting fraud, and saying that's not acceptable, versus celebrity doping being acceptable but not a fraud.
Right.
Yeah.
And sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, both lead to issues like body dysmorphia and anorexia, bulimia.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though, because some of the symptoms you said were your skin cleared up, you could think clearer, you had better recovery, more energy. So it sounds like you had other health benefits aside from
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And they're the benefits that you could look in the mirror and observe. The tangible benefits.
Right.
But of course, your body is is an ecosystem, and if that's happening on the outside, what's happening on the inside?
Right. And
what I was finding is that I was becoming more aware as well, and bizarrely more intuitive at that time. So I think there's a knock-on effect with your pineal gland. So it becomes an interesting subject then.
Yeah.
That you have WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, saying, don't take these drugs, they're dangerous, they will kill you. While I'm taking these drugs knowing they're not dangerous. And it's making me healthier, more alert, and more coherent. So then fast forward to 2022, where the pharmaceutical industry is saying, take these drugs, they're safe, they won't kill you. But we know that they are potentially killing people and they are unhealthy. So it seems very much to me like sport is being used to stigmatize a group of pharmaceuticals that are human enhancement drugs.
Well, yeah, go on.
while allowing state athletes to use those drugs to climb to the top of the medal tables, while simultaneously pretending that their athletes aren't taking those drugs to get to the top of the medal tables, in spite of them beating other athletes from other countries that are clearly taking those drugs.
Right.
So there's contradictions there, massive contradictions that are glaringly obvious as well.
For sure. Well, where my head goes with it does seem like there is an agenda. It seems like this is very much tied to the agenda.
Yeah. And so I become quite vocal about this. I was a bit annoyed and frustrated. And was pretty much with certain people, I was open with what I was doing and I was asking questions. And then I had UK anti-doping knock on my door at, I think it was 10:30 p.m. in the evening, asking me to do a test.
10:30 in the evening?
10:30 in the evening, yeah. And initially I said no, because I was worried I might provide a positive and get banned. So I said, no, look, just go away. And I wasn't really aware that they could do that. I thought that they could test professional athletes who were at the time on a whereabouts program that they'd signed into, and they were elite level athletes. And I was also aware that they were doing no testing at any events. And they were actually not making any effort to catch people. And in some cases hiding what the cynic would call a state-funded doping program within the UK. Wow. Which was a concern, and there was a lot of people who suspected that might be the case. So to add to that, just so people know what is going on there, one of British cycling's top doctors has recently been struck off by the General Medical Council after it was discovered that he had ordered testosterone, which is banned under the WADA code, unless there's a therapeutic use exemption, which there wasn't. And he was holding that testosterone and other doping products in the Manchester Velodrome, which is the head of British cycling. The head offices of British cycling are at the Manchester Velodrome. So this was the doctor that worked on Britain's Olympic success, their track success from between 2011 and 2017. Interestingly, there are 2 athletes that died in their sleep, which is one of the reported side effects of EPO, is that your blood can get so thick that it can clot and you can die in your sleep. Now, 2 athletes died. One died in 2011 in his sleep. Another died in 2017 in his sleep. And another athlete under the care of British Cycling, or who was a former British cycling athlete, also died in their sleep only 2 or 3 months ago.
Wow. So there are contraindications. There are negative impact.
Well, yeah. So what WADA are now trying to say is that although in the pre-Lance Armstrong era, they were saying that EPO could cause you to die in your sleep, they're now saying that maybe it doesn't, and maybe you don't die in your sleep, and maybe those athletes didn't die in their sleep. You know, and that comes on against the backdrop of now 3 British cycling athletes, or athletes in Britain, cyclists in Britain, that have died in their sleep. And these are all athletes under the age of 15. And we know that there was an athlete who was 16 who was recently banned for being in possession of EPO. And what happened there is he went on a training camp with his friend, and the friend's dad found some foil, which was something was wrapped in foil and put in the back of the fridge in their apartment in Mallorca on a training camp. And he undone the foil, which was alleged to be chicken breasts or chicken thighs or something. Okay. That was vials of EPO, because you have to store EPO in the fridge. So he had traveled to Mallorca and flown to Mallorca with EPO in a flask to keep it cool in the flight, and then got to the apartment and put it in the fridge. The athlete's dad reported that to UK anti-doping, who then sanctioned him. But all of the sanctions you see coming through UK anti-doping are that way. It's someone's chopped someone else in, and they've not really been able to not act on it. But what we discover is that when they do get given information when they should act on it, they don't act on it. So yes. and this is what happened to me. So I ended up in a situation where I was suspended because I refused to provide a test, because when they knocked on my door, I didn't give them the test.
Right. So you were suspended. Yeah. So what do you think is going on? Like, why do you think there is so much corruption, and why do you think they're doing this?
Yeah. Well, when you look at the Lance Armstrong case, what happened, there's a rule within the anti-doping rules called substantial assistance. So if an athlete is facing a 2-year ban and they provide information that leads to the discovery of another anti-doping rule violation, or should lead to the discovery of an anti-doping rule violation, or the discovery of a criminal act, then that athlete is entitled to a reduction of their suspension for a period of up to 75%. Now, that's what happened in the Lance Armstrong case. They sanctioned Lance because there was a federal investigation that was undertaken for sporting fraud against some of his teammates. And the FBI knocked on the door with a gun and a badge and said, you need to talk to us and tell us what's happened. Now, those athletes talked to them and told them what was going on. Those witness statements should never have ended up in the hands of USADA, which is US anti-doping, but they did somehow. They then sanctioned Lance, and the athletes received a reduction of up to 75%, which saw them serve a 6-month ban out of competition. So what happened with me is they suspended me and said, look, we're going to ban you for 2 years of failing to provide a sample. And I said, look, I'm frustrated by this situation. I'm aware that doping seems to be an open secret. Mm-hmm. Here's what's been going on. Here is the prescriptions written by this doctor.
Right.
Here is this, here's a witness statement from me to say what the doctor did, who he worked with, mm-hmm. that included 150 Premiership footballers, Tour de France cyclists, track and field athletes, and elite level boxers in the UK. So I was annoyed that I was kind of disillusioned by sport. I realized that doping was one of those things that you probably had to do to get a career in sport. And it was almost a necessity. But it was also an open secret that people knew about. So I went to UK anti-doping with these prescriptions, this doctor, and more, and they said it was of little to no use to them, and didn't want to know.
No.
Which was bizarre.
Yeah, very bizarre.
And it was more bizarre because UK anti-doping market themselves as running an intelligence-led solution to anti-doping. So their rationale for not being at events and not doing tests was that they ran an intelligence-led solution. So what they were asking is athletes to come forward with intelligence.
Okay.
So what we're finding is the athletes that have come forward with intelligence have then, in some cases, themselves been, the cynic could argue, they've been set up as a doper themselves so as to discredit that athlete.
But I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't catch it.
So some of the whistleblowers that have provided intelligence, they themselves have then alleged to have been doping. So rather than investigate the intelligence that athlete has provided, they then investigate the athlete and say, well, actually, you're doping. Mm-hmm. But of course, you're a rubbish athlete, so no one should listen to you, and you're a doper. And wow. But your information is of no use to us. And it's a pattern that's forming quite frequently. I know athletes like Nicole, I think Nicole Cook has made a lot of noises about this, and she was an elite female. Well, she rode a British cyclist who was a world champion and has been really vocal about doping in sport in general, in cycling. Mm-hmm. And nothing's really been done with it. So that period where I went to them, that was probably around 2014. So in 2021, the General Medical Council struck off a British cycling doctor who was 100% in possession of testosterone. And that was why the British Medical Council, or the General Medical Council, the GMC, struck Dr. Freeman off. The doctor that I gave UK anti-doping information to ultimately was struck off by the General Medical Council as well. Yeah, so that was what was going on, and then obviously there was the Sunday Times picked up. I contacted the Sunday Times and told them what was going on, and then they picked up the investigation, and they went and done the investigation themselves.
And what did they find?
So what happened is the Sunday Times at the time were running a story that at I think it was may have been the 2011 World Athletics Championships, they'd been given anti-doping tests from pretty much the entire field. It was hundreds of blood tests that were taken at the World Athletics Championships, of which 60% of those tests showed blood samples that were indicative of blood doping. But at the event itself, only one, or it might have been one or two athletes had been sanctioned and caught. But the actual blood test showed that roughly 50 to 60% of these athletes were clearly doping.
Wow.
And their bloods and their tests proved that. So the question that the Sunday Times was asking, well, hang on, it's this obvious. Why are you not catching anyone?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is around about the same time where Daniken, who was then the head of the International Athletics Federation, had been caught bribing a Russian athlete who had failed a doping test for EPO and blackmailed her to the cost of 400,000 euros to keep a positive secret. Now, obviously, while Daniken was doing this, he was head of the IAAF. Second in command at the IAAF was Sebastian Coe, or Lord Coe, who was the organizer of the 2012 Olympics, whose aide, whose personal secretary or personal assistant was a guy called Nick Davis, who also was later found to have been connected to a 25,000 euro payment that was paid to his wife's account while his wife herself worked for the World Anti-Doping Agency.
No conflicts of interest at all.
None at all.
Wow.
So the Sunday Times was reporting on this, and ARD was also reporting on this as well. And ARD are a German television channel, and the reporter there, the journalist there, was a guy called Hajo Seppelt, Hajo. So Hajo was reporting on this. The Sunday Times was reporting on this. Unbeknownst to them at the time, I was battling with UK anti-doping in court on this stuff. So I did what any kind of sane person would do, and thought, well, if UK anti-doping are not going to investigate this, perhaps the Sunday Times are. So this was when journalism was still alive and strong to a point. So what the Sunday Times did is they immediately contacted me back and said, you need to come in, have some lunch, sit down, have a chat, tell us what's going on. We need to legitimize what you're doing. We need to see the emails. We need to see the evidence. And they were really, really thorough. So they then decided to go undercover and organize a meeting themselves with this doctor that UK anti-doping said was no interest to us at all, not interested. The fact he's doping 150 Premiership footballers, Tour de France riders, professional elite British athletes, we're not interested in that. We just want to sanction you, the whistleblower. Wow. So the Sunday Times set up a meeting with this athlete under cover of building and developing another, she had Team Sky at the time, another cycling team in Britain that was to compete in the Tour de France. So they filmed this guy in the meetings over lunch saying, yes, I do work with 150 Premiership footballers and I do work with elite athletes and I do dope these athletes. So this investigation continued, these video recordings continued, and they were about to produce the story or report or publish the story. And then they was then introduced to another doctor or another coach that the doctor worked with. That was quite a high profile coach within the Premiership Football League that met with them to say, well, I want in on this project because I'm a top coach and I deal with the nutrition and the training to make the doping work. So the story ultimately went live sometime later, and it blew up. It was the main headline news on a Sunday. It was the BBC would come on, and it was this is the main story,
right.
And it really kind of just exploded from there, really. So it was quite a scandal at the time.
Sure, for sure. So my question for you is, what do you think? It's twofold, I guess. What do you think is like the real mission behind all of that? And then two, what do you think the solution should be?
Well, what happened when the story exploded as it did, it also coincided with the doping scandal with Russia, that Russia was running a state-funded doping program.
Right.
The damage and the embarrassment for Britain or for UK anti-doping was that while UK anti-doping was saying Russia are running a state-funded doping program, they were also saying we know because we've been in Russia investigating them, because WADA paid us to go there. So obviously the elephant in the room was the fact that you're investigating another country's doping while you're not dealing with your own country's doping.
Mm-hmm. We don't see that in any other departments ever.
Ever, no.
Ever, yeah.
So there was an agenda there, and there was some stuff that come out when I think the Russian stuff was interesting because Netflix produced their documentary called Icarus, which was basically word for word like what had happened to me. I think it was Ben Fogel, who's a journalist, who'd apparently made a phone call to a doctor who then apparently hooked him up with the head of or former head of WADA's anti-doping program, who just happened to put him in touch with a Russian coach that could hook him up with all these doping products, who then just happened to go to a race and noticed that there was a huge performance gain there, who then got a call from this Russian doctor saying, Russia are running a state-funded doping program. Now, in my case, it was the hypocrisy was evident, clearly evident. So because of what happened, Parliament contacted me and said, look, we're going to investigate this. UK anti-doping are funded by Parliament, by the British government. So we're going to run an investigation and, make sure it's all tickety-boo and hunky-dory. And so then that was probably 2016, 2016, so gone really quickly. So then I became more interested in corruption, fake news, or what is being called fake news against the backdrop of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
So at that period, in that time, there was also public stories being run about combating fake news, 2012, 2014, combating fake news, which is exactly what you would say you was doing ahead of a large-scale propaganda campaign. If I was going to run a large-scale propaganda campaign, I would say that I'm obviously the good guy because I'm combating fake news and disinformation. Sure. So, you kind of start joining dots as such.
Sure.
So that was really my background in terms of what sparked my interest in corruption and propaganda and fake news versus silencing people under guise of it being fake news.
Right. So what did you start to I guess before we get into the fake news and the corruption, what do you see any potential solutions for the doping problem? Like,
well, the obvious one is say we legalize it. Yeah. The issue is if you legalize it, you'll find out that no one's going to go any faster.
right.
You know, that it's like walking into a gym. You know, we've all been in a gym at some. Most of us has been in a gym at some point. You look around the gym, if it's kind of a warehousey, kind of hardcore gym, there will be people in there that you look at straight away and think, well, he's that person, either he or she is taking steroids. And in that environment, it's very open. You know, you can approach those athletes and they'll tell you what they're doing, what their cycles are. And you can go online and find bodybuilding forums that are very open about their doping and also very open about their diets and what they're doing to get lean. So
in bodybuilding, they typically have categories for like
clean and not clean.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
And what you find is the big guys don't get any bigger. You know, once you're in that, we're all doping.
Sure.
You know, it's kind of refining things to work for you in the same way that you would refine your training. But those guys aren't, you know, getting a lot bigger than the other guys. There's a jump where you see relatively well-built, you know, clean athletes who then maybe gain, you know, a lot of muscle because they're doping. They don't get any bigger past that point.
Sure.
So from someone who's done this stuff and can identify what the performance gains are, beyond that, there would be more gains through working with doctors or coaches that know how to utilize, how to get the best out of the doping products. But beyond the initial huge jump, you're not going to get, you're only refining where you are. Yeah. And of course, the other thing with improving your recovery to that extent with those drugs is you don't get ill when you're healthy, and you could hold down a full-time job and still train like a professional athlete. And what you sort of see in these circles of open doping is that most of those athletes that look really healthy and really lean are actually eating really bad diets. I know of two elite British athletes who live off of tinned hot dogs and low cost hot dog rolls, and their diet is largely crap. But they can just recover really well, and you know they'll publish books about nutrition and diets, and people will listen to them because they've got the results and they look the part.
Right.
And that is fraud.
That's absolutely fraud. Of course, that's fraud.
Yeah, and it leads to eating disorders. It leads to disillusioned athletes. It leads to real tangible problems, real tangible health problems.
Right. So do you think the solution would be to legalize it and make it an open thing that people can choose whatever path they want to choose? Yes
and no, because if you legalize it, one, you know, some of these drugs are off, you know, you can only get these drugs with prescriptions, which is why you see athletes working with doctors.
Sure.
Because the doctor's giving them the prescriptions. You know, no one really seems to be joining the dots that, you know, if you're a world-class athlete, why do you need a doctor? Because you're healthy all the time, and if you're sick, you shouldn't be competing, you know. So what are the doctors there for? And those doctors will openly tell you why they're there. It's no secret in the medicals. You know, we work with athletes for one reason.
Business.
Yeah, all's fair in love and war. That's the scenario, and that's when doping's an open secret. It really is an open secret, and that's that. So the issue is, I don't think you should legalize it, because you can't legalize it, because the drugs need a doctor to prescribe it, and people will have a mindset that more is better. Sure. You know. And drugs like EPO can lead to blood clots. But then you then move towards kind of other issues with the medical industry as a whole. And the medical industry as a whole seems to want to treat sick people. And they want to give the drugs to cure the problems that are caused by their substances that are in the food we eat and the water we drink. So,
or by the prescription they
yeah,
prescribed that now have other symptoms.
Yeah. So you kind of go full circle then, because you say, well, okay, well, if that is going on, these human enhancement drugs are being banned and stigmatized through sports doping, but used by sports people.
Right.
There's another hypocrisy there that you see in other areas. So, for example, Russia are running a state-funded doping program, giving their athletes performance-enhancing drugs. Those athletes are very healthy. They look very healthy. British athletes look very healthy. US athletes look very healthy. Spanish, French, German athletes look very healthy. We know some of those athletes are getting sanctions. We know those athletes are taking performance-enhancing drugs. But what if those performance-enhancing drugs that are also being used in the anti-aging industry can improve the life of humanity as a whole, leads to a healthier living? And what I mean by healthier living is the drugs don't make you healthier. What they do is they detoxify your body, heal your body, allow you to hold down a full-time job, be a busy mother, and then go out and do a 10-mile run before dinner, after dinner, before you go to bed, and then recover, not get post-viral fatigue issues, and generally live longer, live healthier, live cleaner. But of course, how does that work for the pharmaceutical industry that make lots of money from treating sick people?
Yeah, bit of a conflict there.
Yeah. So sports being so I'm not necessarily into kind of state-funded doping programs and what countries are doing. I'm more into a scenario where you have to ask, if sport is being stigmatized, if sport is being used to stigmatize pharmaceutical products that enhance humans,
right, and
negate the need for some of the other drugs that are used to treat sick and poorly humans.
Sure.
Because I think if you took an obese person, gave them erythropoietin or EPO, allowed them to burn the fat quicker, recover quicker, heal, detoxify, they would actually want to then eat healthier as well, because they'd be seeing quick results, tangible results, and then they wouldn't be sick, and they wouldn't be obese, and they wouldn't need insulin, and they wouldn't need diabetic treatment for diabetes, and they wouldn't need, the operations that then, they need later in life through poor health, through arterial fibrillation, arrhythmias,
right,
dodgy hearts, all the other problems that go with it.
Right. Well, it's interesting that these programs are state-run programs, because we see that typically they do, a lot of research under the guise of, protection, and then unfortunately sometimes those things get weaponized against masses.
Yeah, and interestingly, one of the largest law firms in England who deal with anti-doping law is also a law firm that deals with early stage patents for the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, that is quite interesting, and that again, no conflict of interest at all.
No. So I'm not that interested in sport now. I deal with sort of other issues around propaganda and what's really going on. I think sport is a small part of that.
Yeah. Tell me.
And I've been looking at history, propaganda, corruption, and I started looking at a lot of the stuff around that period in 2014 and combating fake news. And I, at the time, was really not that interested in politics. I thought Donald Trump was an idiot. I thought Obama was a really cool guy. And in Britain, we were getting hit with lots and lots of anti-Trump propaganda, anti-Trump. Trump said this, Trump said that. Yeah. And for some reason, I don't know why, but I'd seen a snippet from a press conference that Trump had said something And then I looked at the whole press conference, and then the penny dropped, because I'd seen stuff around the Mueller report and the Steele dossier, and the fact that Christopher Steele was ex-MI6, and he was British, and he worked for Fusion GPS, and it had also written a report about FIFA, the Football World Cup. And I started questioning, well, why would you be writing about the president of the United States, but also writing about FIFA and football? Why are you interested in sport? And then that's when it became clear that there's an overarching agenda to demonize a certain person in a certain country at a certain time. It seemed to all roads seem to be connected, really. So I found that really interesting, and I found the legal side of it really interesting as well, because I was interested in law, and I was interested in the Lance Armstrong case and what happened there. I was interested in sports law, litigation in general, and I could see what was going on, and it was, the whole thing stank, basically. So for me, the penny dropped at that point. It was kind of like one of those 5-minute red pill moments where you suspect, when you talk to a lot of people in England, most of them say, I don't watch the news, I don't watch any TV, I've switched it off. And that was really me. I kind of intuitively knew that it was all bullshit and that we was being misled. Right. But wasn't really interested, because it wasn't my fight, it wasn't really something I was interested in.
Sure.
And I think that's by design. If you're really, really corrupt, you don't really care that people know you're corrupt. And I think what we're seeing now is we know they're lying. They don't care that we know they're lying, as long as you never know the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And indeed, if they know that we know that they're lying, then great, because you can seed that demographic who's aware of this with other lies and other rabbit holes and fake stories, and these are the people that are quite vulnerable at the moment, because they intuitively know something's wrong,
right,
and they are intuitively looking for what the truth is,
right,
and they're really, really prone to jump on something that's just not mainstream. And I think when you understand that these people are controlling the mainstream, you would be entirely delusional to think that they're not controlling the non-mainstream as well.
Oh yeah, that's what cognitive infiltration is all about.
Yeah. So that was where I was at, really. So I kind of got up to the 2016 period where it was really evident in the UK that there was just a large-scale attempt to discredit the then president of the United States, whereas previously it was completely polarized when it came to Obama. Obama was the biggest and best and most wonderful president you could ever imagine, and he was really cool, and he was doing like mic drops, and he was just down with the kids. But I didn't really know why. It was like, well, why is he down with the kids? Why is he successful? Why is he a good president?
Right.
And then you start realizing that politics is populist politics, and the BBC are just into opinion forming, and you then, once you clock that, you then start asking why and what is really going on here. So I'm assuming you was in the same position around about the same time.
Yeah, I mean, my journey has been a little bit different. I mean, I've been interested in politics pretty much my whole life. I started a board for school choice when I was like in 6th grade. So
okay, yeah.
So I've been.
You was that person. You was that person at school.
I was that person. Yeah. 6 years later, they actually implemented it, and I like to think I had some part in it, in like getting the ball rolling, but I honestly have no idea. But yeah, no, I've always been pretty interested. I think that, but the difference for me has really been, I've always been kind of much more mainstream kind of,
Mm.
conservative, really more like mainstream, I guess, Republican most of my life. I went through a period, I guess, mostly in college and shortly after, where I tried really hard to align with the other side because I just thought it would be easier. I grew up in a very, left-leaning political area. I was actually penalized in school for academically for my political views.
Yeah.
I was on the debate team and I was always being penalized because I didn't take the side that the judge liked, So I thought it would just be easier, but what I found was that the harder I tried to go further left, the more conservative I actually became, because I started asking all these questions, and but it just started to reinforce more and more of what I actually thought, no matter how hard I tried, because I thought I would fit in more. I just thought it would be easier. But what I think has really happened for me is I've started to see much more of the I guess the globally coordinated, orchestrated agenda. So they use politics as it's a teleological kind of ends. It's they're to serve their agenda. But politics, while I think ideology is relevant, the politics is much more of a game of like divide and conquer.
Yeah.
So, and I always reference this, but the big book here, Carroll Quigley says that the CFR has picked our elections, American elections, for the past 100 years. And that book was in, I think, the 80s. I think wrote in the 70s, maybe published in the 80s. Don't quote me, I'll check that. But but it was a while ago, and so well over 100 years. And so it's my belief that while Trump was very evident in that regard because it was so extreme, I think it was just pointing out the corruption that has existed for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
So my journey has been a little bit different in that regard. It's been much more, going down kind of, what is the coordinated effort that is behind all this. So
and I think that's the question.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of people are asking, isn't it? What's behind the curtain?
Yes. And his other book, The Rise of the Anglo-American Establishment, I think really does illuminate a lot of that. And I think that's why, I think there are people who are waking up all over the world for sure. But, certainly when you look at the synergy of the British and the American governments and the intelligence agencies and how they're working together, it starts to shine light on a lot of what's actually happening.
And it's quite interesting because I was approached by some guys who saw me. I'd around about 2018, I become more interested in just generally traveling. Because of the whole cycling thing, I'd become a bit disillusioned by cycling. I'd kind of realized that most of my traveling was done training. Like I'd go to warm weather locations with a bike and just do lots and lots of training. Right. So I was kind of not as well traveled, and I'd always been interested in history. So we paid Rome a visit in 2018. And at school, I'd always liked the history. I didn't really like school in general. I was more interested in kind of art and graphic design and sport and cycling. And I grew up in the whole kind of BMX, ET era, with Skyways and Diamondbacks and GTs and all these kind of cool bikes, collector's items now. Right. So we ultimately visited Rome and the Vatican, and there were artifacts in Rome, especially in the Forum in Rome, that you look at and think, well, these things don't make sense. And one of the largest temples in the Forum, when you visit Rome, is full of holes. So between a course of bricks, you'd have a T section like this. And I've got some videos, so some pictures of this, so we can show the viewers what these are. Right. and between every block, they look like they've been exploded from the inside. The mainstream narrative is that these have been picked apart in the corners, and they've had metal rods taken out of them that were then melted down and used as weapons. But the blocks that are picked apart from the ground to the top. So this is a high building. This is probably 60 foot, 70 foot high building. Typical Roman temple. And around the front of the temple, there are large columns that are made of a very hard stone, and the columns show slice marks through each column. Now, the rationale behind that is that the barbarians put chains around the columns, and the chains tore into the columns, and they still couldn't pull down the columns. Wow. So I looked at that, and at the time I was really unaware of the Mohs scale and the Mohs chart. Right. So the Mohs chart is a good representation of geological hardness, diamond being hardest, down through copper, iron, granite, different forms of granite, sand, bedrock, etc. So you look at the columns and you realize they're made of a hard stone, and the chains, it's impossible for a steel chain to cut through this hard stone because the stone is harder than the chain. So it's like using the butter to cut through the bread.
Great.
Yeah. And most people get this very quickly as well. And this is one of those kind of another, 5-second red pill moment for people, because most people have a kitchen, and in the kitchen is a granite worktop. If you're really successful and you're well heeled, you'll have a granite worktop rather than a cheaper laminate worktop. Right. And the benefit of granite is that you can't cut through it. You can take any knife out of your kitchen drawer, and you can cut your bread, you can cut cheese, you can cut meat straight onto the granite worktop. And if you're really cautious, you'll have a granite cutting board, or a granite chopping board. And that's because the steel is softer than the granite. The steel on the knife that you're using is softer than the granite. So the granite is cutting through the knife rather than the knife cutting through the granite. And of course, when you look into the Bronze Age, Iron Age, you compare that to the Mohs scale, you'll find that the tools are a hardness of maybe a 3 or a 4. Diamond is a hardness of a 9 or a 10, but the rock they're carving is a hardness of an 8 or a 7. So the thing they don't teach the children at school is that they're cutting granite with tools that are twice as soft as the granite is. So I become more interested in this stuff after a trip to Rome in 2018, because I'd visited the Vatican, and in the Vatican there's granite bowls that are 20 foot wide, 18 foot wide, that are made of solid granite, that are dated maybe 1000 BC, up to perhaps Roman Empire started crumbling at 100, 200 AD. But in Britain, we're kind of lucky because you got the heritage of the Romans and the Saxons, and you visit like a Saxon site, and then near where I live, there's a Saxon castle, which is literally kind of wooden stumps in a circle on a hill. And there's mannequins in there that are dressed up as Saxons in cages, and they're being tortured or burnt alive or whatever they are. And it's all very primitive. But you go to that timing period, that period in time, and it's 100, 200, 300 AD. Whereas in Rome, they were carving granite with metals they just didn't have at the time. So I sparked my interest in, I'd read von Daniken's book, and I'd become involved with corruption, and I testified to Parliament, and I knew what was going on in terms of the public aren't seeing the full picture. So I started asking, well, what could be going on in archaeology if these ancients are cutting solid hard stones with soft tools? They clearly weren't the tools that they clearly couldn't have been doing that.
Right.
And then I come across Ben's channel, Uncharted X, and I saw a lot of the Egyptian work that Ben had worked on with a guide called Yusuf Awan. Yusuf's dad had been featured in the Pyramid Code as an ancient shamanic kind of keeper of the oral traditions in Egypt. And he was talking about tunnels underground and big kind of cavities under the pyramids, and that he used to play in those as a child. And then they are there, and you can see them there, and you can visit them there on private tours. So
most towns have like an underground.
Yeah. Exactly. So in 2019, I literally spent a week with Yusuf visiting these sites on a one-to-one basis with the guide, looking at the evidence of high-tech tooling on these sites, and also looking at most of the Saqqara area, which seems to be in tunnels underground. And the tunnels are typically 20 to 22 meters underground. And at the bottom of every tunnel, there's typically large granite boxes. And when you start looking at the obelisks, you realize the obelisks are as high as the tunnels are deep. And the top of the obelisk has a granite pyramidal structure, which represents the story of Ben, which is the creation myth, that says that everything was made on the primordial mound. Before anything, there was the first thing that came was the primordial mound, and it was the creation of the primordial mound. That's what the pyramid on the top of the obelisks represents. The obelisks are as high as the shafts are deep, and at the base of every pyramid is a shaft that's 22 meters deep with a big granite box in it. And when you see open air pyramids, there's a ramp out of the pyramid, there's a shaft, and then there's a ramp out of the pyramid. So what it looks like is that the ramp out of the pyramid was maybe where they were taking the boxes out and not putting the boxes in. And when you look at the whole Saqqara area, it's a mining zone. It looks like they are tunneling for the boxes. They're not digging tunnels to put the boxes in.
Oh.
And you can see evidence of that. So I'm working on something that will go through the evidence of that. But the main site is the Serapeum of Saqqara, and in that there are 24 100-ton granite boxes that are dropped in to niches. As you go down the corridor, there's a niche either side, in the same way that you'd see the walls in a hospital. You'd see a corridor, and either side there'd be hospital walls. These 100-ton boxes are then dropped into these niches, and the niches are 6 to 7 foot lower than the ground level. But the niches are also equally the same level as the lid of the boxes. So the question is, how did you get the boxes in there? No one's really asking why the boxes, why the top of the box and the base of the lid slides off of the box, why it's exactly the same height as the floor. Because you wouldn't carve 24 100-ton boxes, move them into a tunnel, and the tunnel is so small that you wouldn't physically be able to fit the slaves into the tunnel to drag the boxes. If you needed 150 slaves to drag a 100-ton box,
right,
you can't get them into the tunnel. The other anomaly is that each box lines up north, celestial north, and the tunnels are cut into the bedrock, and there's no tunnel above. So they obviously found a way of lining these boxes up north without looking at the stars, because you can't see the stars because the tunnels are in the bedrock. Now it becomes quite interesting, because you start looking at this subject and meeting other people. You know, we're living in that time where it's quite easy for me to reach out to you and we do a video, or to make contact with people and share ideas. And this is kind of what's interesting in present times. So I know one channel has done work on the pyramids to say that the pyramids are literally the blocks that have been cut out of the tunnels that have been stacked up. Because if you're mining for these, if you're creating these tunnels and you're cutting out bedrock cubes from the tunnels, and no one's meant to know that you're looking for the tunnels, one, you need to find somewhere to put that level of bedrock, and two, you need to create a distraction.
Wow. Yeah, sure.
Now it becomes interesting when you see that distraction is a pyramid, and the pyramid is printed on the money. Yeah. And the money's got an eye on it. And we're told that it's the all-seeing eye of the Illuminati.
Right.
While Nat Geo and History Channel are constantly feeding us programs asking us how they made the pyramids. But of course, it's not the all-seeing eye. It's our eyes that all seeing the pyramid.
Right.
And the pyramid's a distraction.
So what
is it a distraction from is the question.
Yeah, of course, that's the question then, yeah.
So the question then is well, okay, what could they be distracting us from?
Right.
So you then look at the mainstream agenda or the mainstream education or indoctrination program, which is largely Roman, Saxon, Egyptians and Greeks.
And what?
Roman, Saxon, Egyptian, Greek.
Yes.
Look at that. Look at nothing else.
Right.
Then you start looking at the Roman buildings and the Roman structures, and they look remarkably similar to Victorian buildings.
It's true.
And there are similarities between the temple in Rome that has got these blocks that are blowing out, that are said to be corner blocks that are picked out so that you can access the metal structures that are inside the block. Yet they've built on top of those blocks after picking out those structures, and the same building is still there 2,000-3,000 years later. And of course, now it's bearing more weight than it was when it was constructed originally, minus the supports that are holding the building together to stop it falling over while it was bearing less weight.
Right.
So you then see that style of building, and you start looking at the same style of building in the UK, for example, the National Portrait Gallery. And at the National Portrait Gallery, you see strange corner blocks that match the corner blocks that have been blown out or picked out 2,000 or 3,000 years earlier, at around about the same time of the fall of the Roman Empire. So not only do they match the style of the buildings, they actually match the specific construction of the buildings, match the destruction of the buildings you see in Rome. So you then start looking at what defines an ancient building. What makes an ancient building? And could some of these ancient buildings be very similar to the kind of ancient shipwreck that you see in the bottom of a fish tank, or the ancient castle that you see placed strategically at the bottom of an aquarium? And you start thinking, well, are those fish swimming around the aquarium wondering what fish sailed the ship into the aquarium, or what fish built the castle? Do the fish in the aquarium know that we put the castle there and we put the shipwreck in the bottom of the aquarium to make the aquarium look nice? Did the fish think there are, what's the perception of the fish in the aquarium looking at their surroundings? What do they think the purpose of those surroundings really are? And are we like the fish swimming around in the tank, looking at our castles and looking at our shipwrecks and our archaeological equivalents? And are we wondering what fish sailed the ship into the fish tank, and how did that ship sink into the fish tank in the first place? So you sort of start going down these rabbit holes of archaeology and history.
Yeah.
And that was really what intrigued me to reach out to you, because I saw Alex talking about secret history.
Yep.
And that is where the distraction agenda is really interesting, because we're all looking at the pyramids, or we've been looking at the pyramids for a very, 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 very long time.
Right. Yeah.
We're not looking at recent history, particularly looking at recent history from the period of 1700 onwards.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was a point I made to you, Alex, actually, was that I noticed things seem to really change, and a lot of destruction, and, you know, a lot of things seem to be hidden at that time. Like, we don't.
So you then start looking at the British Empire, the relationship with the United States, and the colonization of the United States as well. And then you start looking at the things that Alex has been looking at, like the architecture, and you realize that the architecture is very much what you see in Europe and what you see in all other places all over the world. So going back to the more ancient history, I was invited into a group of individuals. One of them's got a YouTube channel called Ancient History Criticisms. And Andrew has studied history on kind of the alternative level and also the academic level. So he knows it from both sides. And I don't think there's anyone else on the planet that is more rounded in terms of knowledge of these sites, names of the sites, where the sites are, how old they are, and what detail exists in the photography that can be found in various different platforms, whether it's, you know, vintage photography, where it's people's holiday photos, whether it's sketches or Google images, or, you know, TV documentaries, etc. So what he's done is put together a library of all the sites by name in folders that you can access and view the small details. So one of those small details is the nub type structures that we see in Sacsayhuaman, where you see these polygonal blocks, and on the blocks there's a shape that's been extracted, like two fist shaped protrusions from the blocks.
Right.
So we see that in Peru, we see it at Coricancha, we see it in Sacsayhuaman, we see it all over Egypt, we see it in Rome, we see it all over the world. So that would be a hallmark of the people that built that, in the same way that a swoosh on a pair of Nike trainers is a hallmark for the people that made the trainers. And you see those trainers on people's feet all over the world. You see it in sport, you see it in, you know, you see it in fashion, you see it in rap music. We all know what that swoosh looks like. Yeah. But that nub shaped structure is also similar to the swoosh in the fact that it's a hallmark of the manufacturer, in the same way that swoosh is a hallmark of the manufacturer of the trainers. So what that then done is it struck up a conversation about what other hallmarks exist in the same locations, and you see other hallmarks. Firstly, you see the polygonal rocks that look like they're softened, and you see that all over Peru. You see it in you see it in the Coricancha, you see it at Sacsayhuaman, you see it in the Valley Temple in Egypt, and so on and so on and so on. And within those rock structures, you also see bevel block structures as well, that you see all over the Roman world. You see it over Egypt, you see it in Peru, in Lebanon, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on and so on and so on. So it doesn't take you long to realize that there's a collective hallmark of archaeological building processes that span lots of different time periods.
Okay.
For example, the Coricancha looks identical to the Valley Temple, which is outside the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And the issue is that the Coricancha is 1000 AD, 1500 AD, wherever we are on that. But yet the Valley Temple was 2000 BC. So the same people were building exactly the same thing with a technology that we don't know they had, or we don't know what they had, spanning a 3,000-year period. So what that tells you is that the same people built the same thing, and they probably built it at the same time. And the Valley Temple, initially I was looking at Valley Temple thinking, well, it makes Peru older, because if this is in the Valley Temple, 2,500 BC, the Coricancha in Peru must be older than we think. Then you look at the Valley Temple and you see that those blocks are laid behind an even older structure, which means that the blocks in the Valley Temple may be far newer than we think, far less old. So that was where I ended up with kind of looking at hallmarks of a collective builder race across the whole planet. And then I started becoming aware of things like star faults, and you realize that star faults also have nubs on them. And star faults are part of this, kind of Tartarian type theory that there was also a global race of people that were building the same structures. Well, we see that in the supposed ancient history, and we see it in the more recent history around star faults. And in the same period, you've got the creation of the cathedrals and all the other things that go with that as well. So you then start questioning the cathedrals, and you look at a scenario where we're looking at pyramids because pyramids are on the money. Around that archaeology, there's a very clear, very obvious group of global builders building a handful of ancient sites. Peru being one major site that we're all taught about. Machu Picchu, for example.
Right, sure.
Coricancha, Sacsayhuaman, we all know about that. The other one is the pyramids, which is, that's not going to change with repetition. We all know what the pyramids are meant to be. And that is really it. There's not a lot more. There's sites in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, places like that, Vietnam, etc. But that, when you really ask your average 16-year-old to name go-to historical sites, they'll say Peru, they'll say Egypt, they'll say Rome.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the kind of, that's wholesale history. That's what you get.
Wholesale history. I like that.
Yeah.
Right.
So how do you view history? And like I said, I've got a background in kind of like the legal stuff and or commercial background in that anyway, and an interest in that, and that covers anti-doping and civil litigation as well. So what you need to do is view history as the witness statement of the suspects around the crime scene. But what they're teaching us is the witness statements are real. Yeah. And they're teaching us to not look at the evidence ourselves.
Right.
In fact, we'll take over from here. We're the clever guys. Yeah. Just outsource your intelligence to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. But by the way, Orange Man bad. Previous man good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't ask any questions about those weapons of mass destruction that we didn't find in Iraq.
Don't do that.
Or that third tower that fell down without anything hitting it. So they're the same people telling you history is real and this is what it is. And then you start looking at education now and you realize that they're not actually really teaching you much about that, other than just here's the images and, dress up as a Roman, dress up as an Egyptian, it will make it all real.
Right.
Wear a face mask, it will make it all real. That happened in 2018. It happened in 20, well, it happened in 20, it was there's evidence that fashion forecasting companies were forecasting neo mint and purist blue for the fashion industry in 2018 for spring 2020. So WGSN WGSN is a fashion forecasting company. Yeah. They are owned by the same group of people that own the Guardian newspapers, morning television programs. And the history there goes all the way back to mid 1800s, where the owner of the newspaper was set up newspapers in local towns where there's big cathedrals to tell people the history of the town and the cathedrals. Fast forward to 2018, after a few rounds of purchases and acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, WGSN is one of those companies that do fashion forecasting. So in 2018, they forecast a sky blue color, which they named purist blue, against a PPE green, which they called neo mint. And they forecasted those colors globally, along with Pantone, to be the color of spring 2020. Now, in 2020, the same company was forecasting blue and yellow to be the color of spring 2022.
Wow.
All of the high street all of the high street brands that you see rely on WGSN. A license with WGSN is, I think it's $800, £800 per month. And that's where people resource their color forecasting for the fashion industry. On an academic level, when you're doing a degree or masters in fashion, everyone gets a free WGSN license. All students get a free WGSN license. So therefore, they're indoctrinated into WGSN in the same way that they're indoctrinated into Pantone before they go out to the commercial world. So the minute they go to the commercial world, the go-to forecasting company is WGSN.
Wow. That's
when people say if there's a scam globally, how's everyone in on it? Well, you don't need to be in on it, because everyone's compartmentalized and everyone's indoctrinated into those forecasting companies. So that mirrors and echoes what you see with the Lancet journal.
They're creating. Culture is not, it doesn't just happen. Culture is created.
So you go upstream and you look at who's directing that from the top. And then you go upstream and you ask why we're all looking at the pyramids.
Right.
Excuse me. And you go upstream and you say, why is the pyramid all printed on the money? And why is there a great big eye over the top of the pyramid? Because it's not.
Tell us.
Yeah. So we're all looking at the pyramid under the pretext of there being an all-seeing an eye and an all-powerful entity. Which, like the Wizard of Oz, the minute you look behind the curtain, you'll find that the wizard is very small and very frail.
Okay.
So if I wanted to make myself bigger and more powerful, then I would create this mythology and this theory that there's an all-seeing eye. But of course, the reality is I don't want you to actually question what is behind the curtain. So as long as you keep looking at the pyramid, you're not looking at the other stuff. And what's happening at the moment is people are looking at the other stuff because there's a overarching feeling of humanity just becoming more intuitive. And most people say they switch off the news because they know it's bullshit. They don't really know why.
Right.
And they haven't really gone looking for something else. They just intuitively know it's bullshit. Those people are vulnerable because if they wake up, they're open to an alternative version of a history. So you can then rein those people back in under guise of them being awake and
Right.
woke and waking up. But of course, what you're doing is you're taking them from one program into another program.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I
because
I
you're
see a lot
awake.
of that, actually. I
Yeah,
see a lot
yeah,
of that. Yeah.
yeah. And I think the QAnon movement, was wherever you are with anyone's opinion on that, that was a group of people that really, if they were told there was a few hidden numbers and some gematria, then that would be true.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
and if you said that was a real attempt to create a digital army to combat fake news, the objective would be to infiltrate that group.
It looks like the classic cognitive infiltration. Like that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And the same thing happened when they were rolling through Bolshevism. There was a scenario where
Operation Trust. Yeah. 1921. Yeah.
Exactly. So from the historical point of view, there's clearly a group of global builders that share the same hallmark, in the same way a brand shares a swoosh
Right. Yeah,
on the trainer.
way.
Yeah. That behind the swoosh, there's a corporate entity that's running the show and dictating how things look and feel, right? The hallmarks that you see around that stuff is few and far between when you compare it to the hallmarks that you see on star forts and on cathedrals.
Okay.
So the hallmarks on cathedrals and the hallmarks on star forts are truly global. They're truly large scale, and they are placed in locations where there is a large city. Geneva being a good example of that. Canterbury being a good example of that with Canterbury Cathedral. So you then look at how you would build Canterbury Cathedral, and you look at when Canterbury Cathedral was built, and you see that Canterbury Cathedral was built originally in 590 AD,
Okay.
and then completely rebuilt in 1070 and finished in 1077. 7 years.
This is like the World Fairs. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Now you then look at a similar modern building that we know and we can quantify, and we know the history of that.
Yeah.
And that would be the Sagrada Familia in the center of Barcelona, that was built by the architect is Gaudi. Gaudi started work on that cathedral in Barcelona in 1880.
Okay.
And work continues on that to today in 2022. So in circa 130 years, we've not been with our current cranes and our current tools, have not been able to build a cathedral, which is on a par with a cathedral that we built in 1070 in 7 years. That was built on top of a site originally that existed at 590 AD. Wow. So you call bullshit on that. And then you start looking at the cathedrals that you also see in other places where there's been colonization. For example, in the United States, there's buildings that are similar to that. And then you look at Australia and there's buildings that are similar to that, and Canada and New Zealand as well. But of course, we've colonized those areas in 1788,
right,
1760, and maybe a little bit before. So I started asking what was going on. I started walking around cathedrals in England, and I started walking around local churches in England. So where I live is a spot between Cambridge, where you've got Cambridge University and all these amazing buildings, and London. So I'm kind of somewhere between the two. But that was a trade route for the Romans, supposedly. So there's a road which is pretty much straight from Cambridge to London. And along that road, there's lots of buildings dated at 1400, 1500, or rebuilt 1800, mid 1700s. And there's a weird scenario where every 2 or 3 square miles is a church that's clad with flint, with a spire on top of it. So you typically got a tower with a spire on top and a church building on the side, and a graveyard. And around the church and the graveyard is several red brick buildings that you'd class as Victorian buildings with a sunken basement. And then obviously you walk around London and there's every building has got a sunken basement, which is far higher than the road, and a toilet that would have originally been in the garden, with a drainage system to support all the water drain off in the basement. You got the road, a gap, and the basement. Now, obviously, it's quite wet and rainy in England. Those basements would flood, so they always had drainage in the bottom of the basement.
Sure.
But you didn't have a sewage system at the time.
Yeah, makes sense.
Because the toilet was in the garden, and they were built in Victorian times. And we get to mid 1850s, and we have the problem of the Great Stench. We'd have to rebuild or build a sewage system, but they'd already built a drainage system in the basements. So you see these kind of cathedrals in these cities, and you see these churches in local villages in and around the countryside of England. And you start visiting the graveyards and looking at the names and the graves and the dates of the graves. And you realize that there are no graves. No graves is the wrong word. On a boots on the ground level, you know, getting your feet dirty, walking around graveyards, looking for headstones. Every 2 or 3 square miles is a countryside church. Several brick buildings around it that are all red brick with sash windows, and then it's a pattern that's repeated all the way through the countryside. Okay. Between those are agricultural fields with 0 trees. The trees that you do see are no more than 200 to 300 years old. And you can quantify the trees because you can cut the trees down and count the rings.
Yeah.
So the question then is, well, where are all the trees? Well, the trees were dug up, roots and branches. Fine. So there are no trees, no. And the roots that would have been left there would have rotted away over 300 years, and they wouldn't be there. But yet you go to Stonehenge, and around Stonehenge is Woodhenge, which is wooden poles that have been put around Stonehenge 5,000 years ago that didn't rot. Well, hang on, if there's tree stumps and tree trunks that were cut down by all these people in England to create agricultural land, and the ones they didn't clear rotted away in 300 years, how did the tree stumps at Stonehenge survive for 5,000 years?
Right.
Those tree stumps mark the movement of the eclipses. Whoever built those trees was desperately tracking the moon. The Aborigines talk about the moon being moved into position. Mm-hmm. The Aborigines are the indigenous people of Australia that were hunted down and killed circa 1850. When you walk around the graveyards, you realize there are no graves pre-1800. Every 3rd or 4th church has 1 or 2 headstones dated between 1730 and 1750. Mm-hmm. Then there's a gap. And then the headstones start at 1800. Every 3rd or 4th church has 2 or 3 headstones dated 1730, 1750, and then there's a gap, and then there's none until 1810.
So nobody died between 1750 and 1810.
But of course, we're exporting people from England, from Europe, mm-hmm. into Australia, into Canada, into New Zealand, right. into the United States, to colonize these massive areas of land.
Sure.
Right? There's forests that have just been cut down, roots and branches removed, over miles and miles and miles of agricultural flat land with no trees. So you then go to some of the older British cathedrals like Westminster Abbey, and what you see when you enter Westminster Abbey is just a grotesque display of marble statues that all begin at 1710, 1720, of lords and sirs and knights and peers and writers of poets and history writers. You then revisit your history that you're reading about Egypt, Rome, and then you look at who's writing that history, and you realize that the same people are writing history in 1810, 1820, 1830. They define history. People like Flinders Petrie does all the work on Stonehenge, does most of the work in Egypt, excavates the Serapeum of Saqqara, notes that there's 2,400-ton boxes in there, draws some sketches of it. Yeah. In 1840, 1850, they bring in a rule in England that says that every town has to have a library. In 1860, they bring through the Education Act that says all of the children that are working in the factories as slaves have to learn this history. So what you see is you see no graves pre-1750. You see a gap. In 1800, the graves start piling up. They start exploding. In London, you see the explosion of Victorian buildings with basements, all look like they're built all at the same time. People say, well, where did the mud come from that raised the road? The bigger question is, where did the mud go that built the basements? So miles and miles and miles, square miles of land was removed to build basements, was taken out of the basements across all of London. Where did that mud go? It didn't go in the middle of the road. We know that the depth of the basements were already dug for and plumbed for sewage works, not sewage works, for drainage works. We know that the basements didn't flood. We know that there's very little evidence of tombs and graves on a localized level. We know there's a gap. We know there's an explosion of Victorians in 1800. We know that there's also no graves, mass headstones, mass burials in America, United States, because we simply wasn't there. We colonized it. We know that we also colonized Canada. Right. And there are no graves in Canada. We know that there are also no graves on that level in Australia, because we also colonized Australia. We know that there are also no graves in New Zealand, because we also colonized New Zealand. So
they're all a commonwealth of.
There's an overarching lack of any real graves beyond the indigenous people in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, and the United States. So in your mind, if you quantify the size of the lands there, and then remember that those lands have been colonized by people coming from Europe, typically. Right. But there's no graves in Britain as well, bar, the kings and queens that you see in the abbeys, and the general belief that there are a few, historical names and historical people written into the history between this period. Right. And we're all being made to look at the distraction, which is the pyramid. That you start asking, well, what is going on? And then you go back to who was writing the history and what was said in that history and how it was defined and how it's not been redefined since then. So you're seeing globally not much evidence of people. Okay. In the British countryside, you're seeing no evidence of trees. They've all been removed. Well, they've all been removed by the people that you can't find. So the mainstream will say, well, this is just crazy because we didn't celebrate death and we didn't build headstones. Fine. We managed to build massive cathedrals in 7 years, like Canterbury Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, all these other places. Right. And are we saying that the builders of those sites didn't just think, well, I might just carve a headstone for my wife that died last week?
Well, and also pyramids are for the deceased.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, all of our history is built on reincarnation and celebration of life and death. Yeah. All of our religion is. And most of our historical sites are sacrificial, religious, commemorative, etc., etc. So what it looks like is that the colonization stories of Australia, Canada, America, New Zealand, and other locations coincide with a point in England where there are also no people.
No people.
And then when you see the explosion of the buildings and the explosion of the graves, you also see the explosion of the written history, the enforcement of the learning of that written history.
Mm-hmm.
You see the orphan trains, and those orphans are taken into the workhouses. And the industrial revolution is largely built on child labour.
Yes.
And we don't know where those children come from. And we can't see any evidence of any adults because they're not buried in any graves and they're colonizing the whole planet. So are we looking at a scenario where something happened at 1700 and literally created a global cataclysm that wiped everyone out? And are we seeing a global repopulation under guise of localized colonization and localized nonsense stories of ancient kings and queens?
Wow. I guess then the question becomes, the cataclysms, were they planned or?
Well, we see evidence of cataclysms. And I was in Westminster Abbey recently, and you see evidence of softened rock in the pillars and the main stones that hold up Westminster Abbey. Mm-hmm. That rock is consistent with the kind of softening and melting of rock that you see in Tanis in Egypt, which has been charred and heated and everything else. Mm-hmm. You look at the ancient sites that you see in Rome, Greece, and the hallmarks of those, and you see that they look very, very, very similar to the buildings that you see in Victorian structures. Mm-hmm. The columns are the same, the brickwork is the same. The only difference is that some have been destroyed and some have not been destroyed. So you then ask yourself, well, what defines an ancient building? Typically it's unfinished, typically it's destroyed, therefore it's ancient. Most ancient buildings are unfinished and destroyed.
Time makes it ancient, not.
Well, the passage of time is what gives you the destruction.
Right. Okay.
And most of those destructive those sites that have been destroyed are buried. So you see areas of the planet where there's destruction and burial. Mm-hmm. And you see other areas of very, very similar buildings that are not destroyed and are partially buried.
Okay.
And then you start questioning the Dark Ages. What do we really know about the Dark Ages? What happened in that 1,000 years? Was it even real? Did it even exist? Did it even happen? So there seems to be a scenario with these star forts and these cathedrals that it's unlikely that modern man built that. And it's unlikely that modern man will ask the question why they keep looking at the pyramids. And it's likely that the pyramid is printed on the money to keep you looking at the pyramids. It's unlikely that Canterbury Cathedral and Notre Dame de Paris and other sites like this were built in 7 years.
No.
So you then start saying, well, okay, you ask yourself, well, is that just some kind of crazy conspiracy theory that's nonsense? Yeah. And what else have we got to say that things are even more ancient? Well, we go way back. We go way, way, way back now to Squatterman, which is the icon that's carved on the walls that then forms the basis as a symbology of the serpent moving around the snake. So Squatterman is a man with his legs apart, his hands apart. And David Talbot has done a lot of work on that, maybe being the symbolism of something that was physically witnessed in the sky, that the planets alive, Mercury, Mars, and Venus aligned, created an electronic discharge, and the electronic discharge kind of scorched the earth of the planet and created a cataclysmic event 20, 30,000 years ago. But of course, those paintings survive in caves, and we've all been rock climbing or scrambled around on the rocks. Yeah. And what's the biggest fear? That as you're scrambling around on the rock crumbles and you fall and die. So the walls of the rocks are very, very fragile. Yeah. The walls of the caves are equally fragile. So are we saying that the cave paintings crumbled around the cave crumbled around the cave paintings, and the crumbled rock that you see on the floor is only crumbled 34,000 years ago, and then it stopped, globally stopped. Yeah. Or could it be that the cave paintings painted on the walls are far recent? And if the people are all over the planet, they were drawing squatter man symbology. And the squatter man, and David Torbert's theory is that the planets aligned and they created a eclipse type profile, which looked like a round circle with two horns. As the planets align, the bigger ones creating a horn shape scenario. Now, depending on where you are around the planet, the position of the horns change, because the planets are lining up differently. So you look at the Aboriginal people who were hunted down in 1800 and genocided, who have recalled the story of the moon being moved into position. You find squatter man drawings all over the caves around in that location. And if the squatter man symbology is recent, it would be completely consistent with what you'd see now. If we had a global genocide, we would run to the caves. Indeed, we wouldn't need to run to the caves, because there would be people in caves somewhere right now. There are people in caves now as we talk. There will be people looking at the cave systems in Wookey Hole, in I think Cheddar in Britain, wherever it is, and Lanzarote. There's loads of cave and volcanic systems that people are visiting daily. Yeah, and so on and so on and so on. There would be people in caves right now with a Sharpie, with a smartphone, with a laptop, with a camera. Yeah. Now, if they witnessed a cataclysmic event on a global scale, that was a genocide intended to wipe all those people off, they would be in the caves now surviving. Yeah. Tomorrow they'd realize what's happened. Yeah. The end of the week, they'd be hungry and starving. Yeah. The end of the next week, they'd probably realize they were going to die. And their only method of recording what had happened would be drawing on the walls, scratching on the walls, marking whatever way they could on the walls. Now, these people would have already had the knowledge to do that. Right. Because we know how you would do that now. We're an advanced civilization. Yeah. Those people then become hunter-gatherers.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. If an incoming group has come in and intentionally wiped off that planet, wiped them people out, and then gone in at a ground level to wipe the survivors out, and they did that at 1700, is that consistent with what we see after we start colonizing America? Yes, we hunt down the hunter-gatherers who were drawing the images in the cave, and we kill all of them. We then go to New Zealand and we do the same. We then go to Canada and we do the same. So you then see the symbolism of the squatter man, and then you then assume that there's a group of people that saw this event happen, a planet-wide genocide, and they're talking about moons being moved into position. If the objective was to amnesiarize that entire new group of people that you're bringing in, which is why you've effectively invaded a planet, you're then repopulating the planet with the orphan trains. You're then repopulating the planet with the colonization of America. You're repopulating the planet with the colonization of New Zealand, Canada, Australia. You're then writing a history in the United Kingdom. You visit the graves, and there are no graves in the United Kingdom. Yeah. You then start looking at symbolism, and you see that squatter man is drawn on the caves. Yeah. The survivors would go to grounds. You're not going to kill everyone. You're going to see pockets of survivors.
Sure.
And then you see pockets of survivors in Wiltshire that were supposedly around Stonehenge area. And what are they doing? They're putting poles in the ground to mark the eclipses. They were desperately trying to mark the eclipses. You know, I've looked for an eclipse. When it happens, I can't see it. It's probably the most anticlimactic thing you could ever imagine, because you have this vision of it all going dark, and you know the planets aligning, you know, sun and the moon aligning, etc. But that isn't what you see. You see nothing. So the people in Wiltshire were desperately putting poles in the ground, desperately trying to see where the moon would be in relation to the sun, where it would be its strongest or its weakest.
Right.
What you do then is you hunt them people down, you kill them. Yeah. There's a reason the poles didn't rot away over 4,000 or 5,000 years. And there's a reason that the roots of the trees in the fields that were supposedly removed for agriculture did rot away in 300 years. Right. Those people were trying to track what was happening, and Robin Heath's work in Wiltshire tells you very clearly that that is an eclipse predictor. You know, in Australia, you see the Aborigines talking about the time that the moon was moved into position. And of course, in 1800, we hunt them down and we kill them. What we then do, knowing that these are the survivors of a planet-wide genocide, and the new people are not meant to know what's happened, we then take their surviving stories and we take their surviving history and we weave it into a fictitious past history. We even take those symbols and we weave them into a fictitious past history. And then we carve them into the fictitious past history, and we carve it into mythology and et cetera, et cetera. The objective is to dilute the recorded knowledge of the survivors of a planet-wide genocide.
So it definitely seems like there's some effort to wipe out history. And it would make sense if there was a genocide. But the part that doesn't make sense to me personally is that, so you would have to have people invested in wiping out this story.
Yeah.
And they would have to be survivors, right? Because if there was, right?
Yeah.
So then who are these people and why are they so invested in erasing the truth?
Yeah. I think if you look at current events, people say, well, who's behind it? So we know that there is a group behind it.
Yeah.
Current events, current politics, right?
Yeah.
Now, if we say, well, okay, you're crazy, you know, you're talking rubbish. There isn't a group behind it, because surely if everyone was in on it, someone would blow the whistle. Someone would say, we're all in on this. But of course, when you look at an invasion of Iraq, hunting down weapons of mass destruction, no one in the military thought they were in on it, because there's nothing to be in.
Bigger picture when you're in it, the forest for the trees kind of thing.
You're running a military operation,
right,
to take out that nation and rebuild your own nation. So we see evidence of this agenda still going on. And we see slicing and dicing and an unsettled civilization and things being moved around and hidden and propaganda and everything else. And we see talk of UFOs, and we see recent talk of UFOs being, oh, they're real. And not only are they real, they're actually a threat. Well, if we're the victims of planet-wide genocide, does it make sense that a craft would travel and navigate time and space, get to Roswell and crash? Or would it be more probable that maybe a craft comes in who's perhaps one of the ones that we're really not meant to be seeing, but shouldn't really be here, and gets shot down? And are we looking at a scenario where a lot of the UFO crashes are potentially a positive group trying to liberate an enslaved planet? And is that why they're being shot down? And is that why they're crashing? And is that why we're now being told that they're a threat to us, when potentially they're not a threat to us? Potentially they're the people that we were trying to put a message out to while we're desperately trying to manage the movement of the eclipses, and get this out. So you then go back and you start asking questions about the cathedrals and the star faults, and who were those people and where did they go?
Right, where did they go?
And why did they have, most of them had no toilets in them? What were these people eating? How did they get the energy to build these sites? Where did they get the fuel from to light the sites up while they were building it? Where did they get the building materials from? How did they communicate across continents and countries and seas and land and everything that goes with it? And how did they share the visualization of those sites?
Right.
How did they come back? You know, if me and you cut the video now, this interview now, and we said, okay, tell me what the room looks like. It's behind you and the room behind me. We'd barely get it right. You know, I wouldn't be able to read the names on the books on your bookshelf. But when it comes to cathedrals, the detail is there. The minute detail is there. They got it all right, site to site to site. The hallmarks are there. The knowledge was there. The sharing of data was there. And why can't we build a cathedral in Barcelona now in 7 years? And why has it taken 130 years to build the Sagrada Familia, whereas it took 7 years to build Canterbury Cathedral in 1070 versus 2022? Well, the period from 1880 to modern times. So I'm intrigued that not many people seem to be viewing this as a crime scene. Yeah. Right. So what we have here is a witness statement saying, no, this is who done it.
Right, yeah? Right. Yeah.
And an education system to say, yeah, he was right. And money that says, yeah, keep looking at this.
Right.
And it's not until you view things as a crime scene and you say, well, what do we see? We don't see any evidence of people pre-1700. We do see evidence of an explosion of people in 1800.
Right.
We do see nonsense saying that explosion of people is orphans. When we do see headstones in those churches, we see one or two, a generational gap, and then the 1800s. So it's almost like a couple of people being placed on site and then given a series of younger people. And there's a 50-year gap between the two.
Right.
And we see that pattern repeating itself in every location where we've colonized a country. And the first thing we do when we colonize the country is we hunt down the indigenous people, the survivors, and we genocide them all. And then we erase their history. And if that's happened, the planet will have a deep recollection of that event at a subconscious level, a level that's horrific.
Yeah.
Beyond belief, that's horrifying. Yeah. The only thing you could relate to that is victims of abuse or torture or imprisonment or enslavement or wars, the most horrifying things you can remember. In fact, they're so horrifying that your brain scrambles those and it does everything it can to not remember that. Now, if I keep reinforcing the memory of that event through the symbolism, the serpent going around the sword is the same as the plasma arc through the Squatterman symbology. Knowing that it's so horrific that you want to forget that, would it make sense for me to weave the symbolism of that event into every single aspect of your civilization, knowing that would make you want to not remember it? And where do we see an event like that, where people have got the truth slap bang in their face with a sword and a serpent around the sword, and in spite of the obvious, they do not want to listen to the alternative, the truth, the threat, what's happening? So I think something is going on with symbolism, with mind control, with trauma.
With symbolism, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the other one.
With symbolism, mind control, and trauma. Yeah. So if you took a victim of Jimmy Savile, who was so traumatized that they've blocked it out, and you make them watch Jimmy Savile videos every day, they're less likely to remember the event.
Well, yeah.
Not more likely, they're less likely to remember it. And this is why you see victims of childhood abuse, maybe they only remember the event through a modern traumatic episode that equals the trauma of the past and brings back those memories.
Right.
And if you was very sadistic, you'd want to keep reinforcing that that original trauma to keep it suppressed. And you'd also want to dilute the survivor's knowledge of that event. So what you do is you weave the symbology into the history as you're writing down the history. And that's why you see the history written from 1800 onwards. You see it enforced through the Libraries Act. You see it taught through the Education Act. And who is it taught to? The orphans. And where did the orphans come from?
We don't know.
No, because you can't find the bodies.
Right. So this doesn't really give us many answers, though. So where do we think?
It does give you lots of answers.
It does. Okay. Tell us what some of the answers are.
So imagine you got the magician doing the trick.
Yeah.
And he's asking you to look at this hand while he's pulling the rabbit out of the hat with that hand.
Right. Yeah? Right. Sure.
Right. When you know what hand to look at, the trick is over.
Sure. Exactly.
The trick ends.
Okay. So
the issue is my view is we now know what hand to look at. And we need to stop looking at the money and the pyramid. And we need to start realizing that we are seeing evidence that something unbelievable has happened. And the architecture we see in the countries that have been colonized doesn't match the story of colonization. That's a given. Not many people can argue that.
No. Now,
the countries that see that and recognize that in its most glaringly obvious way are typically the Australian population. Many of them have been traveling recently with low-cost airlines, low-cost flight, low-cost holidays to Europe. They're returning from Europe and saying, well, hang on, our colonization took place in 1788, the first boat arrived, right? The boat was full of convicts. One of the convicts was 18 years old and he was a stonemason. He was the only stonemason on the first wave of boats that landed in 1788, sorry. By 1790, the second wave arrives, and that's the wave that's carrying the tools. So the first group arrived without the tools and one stonemason who was 18 years old. When you go through the history of Australia and start looking at the buildings that have been built by the stonemasons, they say that this lad taught the stonemasons what they knew, although they didn't have the tools to build the buildings with until 2 years later. And they name the person. But then you start doing more research on that person, you find that they hung him within 6 months of him arriving because he was a pickpocket and he stole the watch off of someone, so they killed him. So a year and a half after they killed him, he's the guy that taught the people to do the stonemasonry work who didn't have tools at the time, who was only around for 6 months. So of course, these people in Australia are coming back and they're traveling around Europe and they're looking at these medieval cathedrals and sites like that and going home and saying, well, I've been to Canterbury Cathedral, that was built in 1070. I'm now in, Melbourne, Sydney, wherever it is, and we've got cathedrals that look just like that. But we wasn't here then. And where are they locking everyone down the hardest?
Right. Yeah. Australia.
Where are you not allowed to travel from? Into. Yeah.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Where are you not allowed to travel from and into?
Right.
Australia. Yeah. And you're seeing patterns forming. So if you start viewing the entire collective as a crime scene and start weighing up the evidence in the way that you would in a criminal investigation, and you view history as the witness statement from the person that says I'm innocent, and you start cross-examining the evidence and the witness statement, this is where you get.
It is also worth noting that if you look at the like the Great Reset agenda, the Agenda 2130, everything starts in Australia. Like a lot of the big testing,
agreed.
smart cities are Melbourne. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And the other thing that's important to realize as well is that if you was doing this, if you was seeding a planet, how would you hand over basic technology and basic inventions on a localized level? So you have to you have to place yourself in the late 1800s now, from say 1870 onwards, right? And you've got the people in place. You've repurposed the old buildings, right? And now you want to hand out the technology, the limited technology that we're going to give these people.
Right. Because it does.
And you would do it.
Ancient
and you would
stuff is fascinating. Yeah.
So you would absolutely do this in conventions and trade shows and fairs all over the world.
Right.
And then you'd knock them down.
Yeah.
Because you're still using the technology that was in place to run the trade shows, while you're giving out a better and a newer technology. The people visiting the trade shows thinking that they're just like rich, wealthy aristocrats. So you're swapping out free energy for light bulbs, coal, steam, et cetera, et cetera. So you're de-teching under guise of up. You're downscaling the tech. Under guise of upscaling the tech. Yeah.
Right.
And
it does.
You're creating a revolution. And it's industrial, and it's fueled by orphans, and there are no graves for where the orphans come from. So, if someone was just to say one element of this in isolation, if it's like, well, there are no graves, therefore there's this genocide thing, it doesn't make sense. But when you start looking at how long do cave paintings really survive, right? How accurate is our carbon dating? In fact, who is carbon dating this stuff? And how do you calibrate carbon dating? Do you take a said ancient sword, and then you create a process that you're calibrating it against the sword? Yeah. But the sword is far newer, then all you've got to do is reuse the same device, because it's calibrated 2,000 years wrong anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So going back to sport and blood doping, one of the things you do to stop your blood clotting is you actually centrifuge, you actually draw your own blood, put it in a capillary tube device, in a desktop centrifuge, spin it, and gravity will separate the plasma and the red blood cells.
Like Pierre.
That's what Pierre exactly. So if you've got 100 milliliters of blood and you want to keep your red blood cell count to 40%, then you're going to have 40 millimeters of red blood cells and 60 millimeters of white blood cells or plasma. If you want to get it up to 50, you're going to have 50 millimeters of red blood cells and 50 millimeters in a 100 millimeter tube of white cells, aren't you? Now, if you want to check the accuracy of that test, you would then go to the doctors and actually get a hematocrit test done by a laboratory at the same time. So what you then do is you cross-reference the blood test with your own home hematocrit testing to make sure it's accurate. In the same way that you'd do that with carbon dating. The difference is I'm giving you a sword that you think is already 3,000 years old. And then you're walking around the rest of the planet using the same device on everything.
Right.
That simple. And that's being rolled out by a group of people with higher tech than we've got, that are aware of the trauma that we're carrying, that understand our psychology more than we do, that are laying out the symbolism that we see on all the buildings, who are writing history to say what they are, that matches the event of Squatterman, which is a global cataclysmic event, against the backdrop of there being no graves, large-scale colonization, waves of orphans, world's fairs, using old tech to sell new tech. And then we are where we are. By 1918, we were in the Spanish flu, we're putting on face masks. We're then into World War I. We're then into World War II, we're all carrying gas masks. We're then into 2018, where WGSN are forecasting blue, forecasting green for spring of 2020. We're then into spring 2020, and then we have a global pandemic where everyone's wearing PPE, which WGSN had forecasted in 2018. And then in 2022, WGSN are forecasting for spring 2022, yellow and blue. And we're now at war with Ukraine. And the people that owned that group of companies go all the way back to 1880, where they're set up with newspaper in areas where there's cathedrals, who then write the news and the history to the locals. And that's where we are.
And that's where we are. So do we have any thoughts on, two questions. So I obviously want to know if you have thoughts on like who the people are. And then my other question is, do you think there's any connection to, you mentioned it really briefly, like you were talking about Tartaria and like, you know, wiped out global civilizations. So, yeah.
Well, I don't think there's resets. I think the word resets is to try and dilute things even further. The key here is to take any surviving knowledge of this event and dilute it through years and years and years of history. And if you can create the gap in time, that gives you carte blanche to create endless stories, endless kings. Sure. It could be that the kings and the queens that we see all over Europe are literally the people that were surviving this event, the clans and the groups that formed to survive it. Mm-hmm. And they were drawing this stuff. They were drawing the swords and the serpents and the squatter man. Right. They remembered it. The problem is you don't want the new people to know what happened. So how would you deal with that? You can't kill everyone.
No. Well, I mean, I think, you know, the Great Reset, we know how they're doing it. They talk about it. It's the transhuman agenda. So if they can, you know,
dilution is key.
What?
Dilution is key. So if you're aware that people who've sketched this out in caves, mm-hmm. who witnessed the event, or just say it was cavemen. Right. They're not survivors. They're just Neanderthals. They evolved from monkeys, and over the years they learned how to scribble a image on a wall, and they couldn't travel, but yet everyone scribbled the same image on the same walls all over the planet. Now, where were those walls? They were in caves. Where do you go when you're trying to survive? You go to caves. Sure. Why are you a hunter-gatherer? Because you've got no supermarkets anymore. How were the ancients intelligent? Yeah, because they already had the intelligence. Right. Yeah. Why did they have the intelligence? Because they were probably placed here originally. Why are we seeing UFOs in the skies? Well, there are other beings from other planets. Why are we trying to colonize Mars? Well, because we like doing stuff like that. It's evolutionary. Yeah, fine. Why would that not have happened to us here before? Why would we not have done that before? Why are we going to the moon? Why are we looking at space? Where do we want to go? What's our ambitions? Our ambitions is to get off planet and colonize planets. So why would that not have happened here? Why would it not have happened here when we've turned up and there's another group here that we don't like? What happens if you travel through thousands of years of time and space in a spaceship? You've been sticking it out and you get to your location. There's another group who are already there. Do we just move in alongside them and say, sorry, we've got nowhere else to go, we're out of fuel? Or do we just go nuclear and wipe them out and land anyway? Because we can't get home. We can't turn around. We can't throw a U-turn, do a 3-point turn and go back to where we come from. We're where we are. We're out of fuel. We need to land.
Wow.
Wholesale colonization, take it or leave it. You know, we're landing on that planet, irrespective of what else is there. So all this is just a logical approach to joining the dots that I've been looking at in terms of the various rabbit holes that you see across social media and alternative media at the moment. Sure. And this is me taking a kind of a broad brush approach and saying, well, how does all this fit together?
Right.
And as much as I try, I can't find another way.
Interesting. There's still so many more questions I have about how to tie things together. I'm thinking we should do a follow-up though. But some of the questions, just I guess the cliffhanger kind of thing. And if you have like, quick thoughts on them, I'm thinking about, there still to me is huge gaps in, there's a common coordinated thread. And granted, you would see that more in recent history than you would see it in ancient history, but I think there's evidence in ancient history too, of some common threads of, people who have this, that they pass on, kind of an agenda.
Yeah.
And, we're certainly seeing, because in order for the agenda to be perpetuated, the successors have to carry it out, right?
Well, here's a question. This question might answer your, say you were in a military environment, and you were trained for a mission that said that you're going to go to another planet, and you're going to be part of a colony on that planet.
Right.
And as one of the early colonists, you're going to get the benefits of being one of the people that settle on that planet early. Yeah. And you then set up your own colony and survival mechanisms, and you've got training in a certain field, whether it's whatever, media, communications, whatever. And then you have children, family, relatives, etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you do? Would you go, well, actually, I've met this guy, Dan Stevens, I'm just going to give it all to him? And your kid's like, mummy, why are you doing that? Like, well, I just think you'd be crap at it. I'm going to give it to someone else. Things don't work like that. You're going to keep it in the family.
Right.
And that's exactly what we're seeing. Prescott Bush funded the rise of the Nazi Party.
Yeah, totally.
His son became president of the United States after he was the head of the CIA.
Exactly.
His son became president of the United States as well. You're clearly seeing bloodlines handing down their position of power. But we don't know where they've come from.
Right.
Or how they've got there. Because all roads end at 1800.
Yeah, it does seem like all roads ended 1800. I noticed as well. It's very interesting.
And the history starts getting written at 1800, just as the Industrial Revolution starts, just as the world fairs are at the end of the 1800s.
It's also where a lot of the secret societies do a lot of their official formulation.
Yeah.
Although some in the 1700s, I mean, the official Illuminati was 1776.
See, I've done a bit of research on kind of like the graves and the tombs, and I was hoping to go to Westminster Abbey, walk into the Abbey, and just see a real effort to create monuments for the King, the Queen, and have a complete history of kings and queens. But no, you walk in there and there's just a grotesque display of lords and sirs and knights that all start 1700s through to 1800s. They're all historians, they're all writers, they're all heads of orphanages, they're all industrial people.
Yeah.
And it's a grotesque display. You can almost hear the echoes of the arguing. I've got to be there. What, me? I want to be there. No, me. What have I done? What have you done? It's gut-wrenching, it's sickening, and it's grotesque.
Yeah.
But behind that is an ancient cathedral that they've just, for want of a better word, they've raped it. And they've put their own importance in there. It's just a repurposing. But you don't see any resets beyond that.
Right.
So I think there's an agenda to create multiple resets, which just haven't happened. Because obviously the more resets you get, the older the history is. So before we wrap up, I think it's important to think of this as well, right? We now know that the mainstream media lie nonstop.
Yeah.
We know that everything they tell us at the moment is the opposite is true.
I wouldn't say the exact opposite is true. There's more nuance than that. You're closer to the truth.
Agreed.
You look at the opposite. Yes.
And we know that people are waking up and they want an alternative version of truth.
Yes.
We know those people are vulnerable, and you're able to capture those people and give them a new version of the truth.
Yeah.
You look at TV programs like Ancient Aliens that say all the aliens look nothing like humans.
Right. They do.
The history is even more ancient than you think.
Mm-hmm.
What's the opposite to both of those?
The opposite to both of
The opposite to the aliens not looking like humans is they look like humans.
Right, of course.
The opposite to the history being more ancient is the history is far newer.
It's more newer. Yeah.
But what they're pushing is through the cataclysmic stories, they're trying to push the history back. But what if the cataclysmic evidence is recent, that's been aged and pushed back deliberately through people that are claimed to be like, who are, on this kind of younger Dryas type train of thought. And of course, those spots are clear. You look at sites through northeast Russia, and they've been bombed flat. There's holes all over Siberia. Yeah, you look at America, the same holes appear in the Caledonian Bays, all over Caledonian Bays. And then you look at the Australia, and you see the same thing in Australia. So something carpet bombed,
right?
Siberia, where you got this whole kind of Tartarian thing, all of the Caledonian Bays, and most of inland Australia. And you see evidence that.
You know what else I think would be really interesting? There's just so many lies around Antarctica. Like when you start diving into that, it's like nothing actually makes any sense at all.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for thinking about an alternative, because if they're controlling the mainstream, they're controlling the alternative media. The alternative media is echoing the mainstream in an indirect way.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, these resets are normal because we've had loads of resets. Yeah. No,
well, that they're not. They don't just.
They're not normal.
They're seeing it right now. The Great Reset is a coordinated, planned effort. This is not just a natural.
But I don't think it is. I think it's a knee-jerk reaction to people waking up to the past. So, if you control the past, you control the present. And if you're going to lose control of the past, and you're going to lose, therefore you're going to lose control of the present and the future,
right?
You'd better start putting things in place to deal with that loss of control.
Sure.
You better start preempting the breakdown of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what we're doing. We can't travel. We've been grounded. We've been locked down. Fuel prices are going through the roof. They're getting higher and higher and higher. Only the elite are going to be able to travel. The layperson's not going to be able to go traveling from Australia to Europe and start questioning cathedrals.
Well, and not only that, I mean, they're controlling literally what it means to be human. I mean, there is it's a very public transhuman agenda. Yeah.
It's a non-human agenda run by non-human beings. And the scenario is, are they elites that see themselves as something else, i.e. we're the plebs and they're the elites?
Right.
Yeah. So non-human, anti-human agenda. What is really going on? My view is that people need to start thinking of this and criticizing this. Don't do your own research on it.
Sure.
But what I'm trying to do is say, look, this is the crime. The history is the witness statement from the guy saying I didn't do it.
Right.
What are we really seeing here?
Mm-hmm.
We can't find the people. We see colonization. We see explosions of people. We see buildings that look like they're already here in areas where we've only just colonized.
Right.
At a time when it's missing graves. And there's a story in every one of those countries to justify the missing graves. Right. At a time when it looks like there's a planetary repopulation with a cover story of localized colonization. It is that simple. So I think like wrapping up, it would be good to for me to put this out there and say, look, this is my view. I don't know I'm right, I'm wrong. But as someone stepping back and saying, well, what do we see if we put all of these conspiracy theories or alternative ideas or work done by kind of truth seekers, we put them all on a pinboard, as you would see the photographs of people in a crime scene, the bullets on the floor, the blood at the round of the outside of the car, the photos of the suspects, and we start drawing, like linking it together with red string, with pins.
Yeah.
And the first thing that I would link is the work I've done on the missing graves, the missing headstones, and that string would go straight to the colonization locations.
Yeah.
And those locations would go straight to the removal of the localized population who are hunter-gatherers. And those hunter-gatherer strings would go straight back to the largest cataclysmic event I could see, which would be Squatterman. And from Squatterman, I'd go straight to the walls of the caves and say, how did those paintings survive that long on those walls while the cave crumbled down around them? And then I would look at the symbolism of that, take that to the secret society symbolism that you see everywhere. And then I would look at abuse victims and trauma victims and say, what is the commonality around most PTSD sufferers and fragmenting the memories? And what have we got on this planet? Globalized amnesia.
Yeah.
And it's intentional.
Oh, it's definitely intentional.
Yeah.
And there are, I mean, you look into the Tavistock Institute, and I mean, they intentionally weaponize this kind of trauma therapy. Yeah. Absolutely.
So you look at these institutions, and another string I would take from the institutions is to military.
Yeah.
And then I would say, well, okay, well, what have we got here?
Right.
And does this look like a cult where everyone's in on it? Or does this look like a military operation?
Yeah, I think it looks a lot like a military operation.
Yeah.
A
group of people, something's come in on a military basis and put all the places on board strategically at the right time, in the right places, and just repopulated.
Wow. Fascinating. So much to think about. I would really love to do a follow-up and dive into.
Oh, yeah, it would be quite cool to speak with Alex as well, because I know.
Let's coordinate. We'll do the three of us. I think that I'll talk to him, and we'll set that up. And
maybe I think there's some guys that I know in the other history groups as well, particularly Andrew, Ancient History Criticisms.
Great.
So maybe Nikki as well. I've been talking to. I've done some chats with them recently. So they're on this page asking the same questions. You know, that's a summary of the rabbit holes.
Yeah, sure.
And if they were pieces of a puzzle, you know, we've got the framework.
Right, for sure.
And that's it. I can't say any more than that. So yeah, appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would continue. I actually have another one. But yeah, there's so much in here, and I think it's good to take some time to process all of it for both me and I think the audience. And yeah, we'll reconvene and we'll set up some of the three-way chats and tell everybody where they can find you, and anything else, any closing things you want to leave us with.
Well, I think if anyone's got anything to say, put it in the comments. You know, it's always good to know, to get the feedback with the waltz as well, so we know what's going on. And you know, it's not, you know, I want criticism. It's I say, this is my observations. And I've been to these sites in person. You know, I've been in every single pyramid. I've been in the Serapeum with Saqqara. I've been to Rome. You know, I visited Stonehenge, and I've done, you know, up close and personal tours of Stonehenge, and there's some interesting stuff around that we should maybe speak to. And I've been visiting the cathedrals as well. So I think it's important, and what I would do is just encourage people to, you know, put down the phone, get off social media, and go and visit these sites. You've got the information now. You've been down the rabbit holes.
A lot more difficult for a lot of people these days, but
yeah. But this is like what's interesting with this is work you can do on a localized level.
There are, yes, Alex was talking about that as well. There's a lot of local, there's underground cities pretty much in everywhere. So
yeah. And there's also eugenics programs. And if you just type in, if you start looking on search page or the other alternative ones, and you put in the name of your town and eugenics, and you'll find there's a eugenics program that goes back way back.
Yeah. And a lot of that was pretty strong through the 1800s too. So that's a whole,
So you've got you thinking now.
What?
Yeah. So I've been down quite a few rabbit holes and done a lot of research, and there'll be people that have done more. So it'd be good to know what they think, and stick it in the comments.
Totally. Yeah, no, that's really interesting to me as well. I've definitely done a little bit of diving on that department. So, and a lot of it is pretty strong in the 1800s. So yeah. All right. Well, tell people where they can find you, and we will reconvene you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I'm on Twitter. I've got a fairly low profile. So yeah, I'm going to start doing some YouTube videos soon. So we can keep people updated with those, and maybe put my Twitter link in your description, and we'll speak again.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.